There we go. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for those very kind words, and thank you very much for coming here after being at a party. You're the hardcore. Normally I don't make the keynote at this time because I've been partying, so thank you very much for showing up. So today I'm going to talk about results varying. So reproducibility is the particular topic I chose. I understand that there's a little bit of history in keynotes at ISMB to give a bit of background and context. So I thought I would do a little bit of that first. So, as Janet kindly said, I'm actually interested in what's called knowledge turning. So that's moving information quickly between laboratories and researchers and allowing them to quickly process and integrate those codes, data, whatever the interesting information artifact that they're using in order to be able to gain new insights. So that's a very abstract idea of what I'm interested in. But I do it in a whole bunch of disciplines. So I'm an applied computer scientist, means I do interesting computing research and developments, and particularly developments, but I apply them. That makes me tricky for my head of school because, you know, I'm not writing theoretical papers in the journal that nobody reads with the impact factor of diddly squat squared, which is what most computer scientists do, let's be honest. But anyway, that's another story. So I work in a whole bunch of areas, including heliophysics, astronomy, and so on. And that's the kind of background that I'll be talking about, drawing on. So the work I've been doing is as a software engineer. I would say I'm really a software engineer. I'm particularly interested in bringing to bear novel technologies in building systems that other people use. Actually, when I was a 16-year-old, I did one of those isometric test things, or, you know, those kind of, what are you going to do with your career? And I was told that I should never do computing. So that tells you how good those psychology tests are, sociology or psychology tests. I was told I should do social work, okay? So, anyway, I became an engineer because there's no money in social work. And I built automated pipeline workflow systems, which I will be briefly talking about. I build pooling and sharing environments for sharing web services in the life sciences, workflows, data, and so on. I work in ontologies and semantic technologies, particularly in how to sneak in semantic annotation without scientists looking, and building open, collaborative sharing environments using the latest technologies, notably open facts, which we heard a little bit about yesterday at Chris Evelow's talk. And I'm interested in how do we bring software engineering practices to science, so particularly scientific software engineering methodologies. And I'm part of software carpentry, which I'll be briefly talking about, and also Elixir. I'm part of the node that's going to be doing training for software engineering practices for bioinformaticians. So the context of my talk really draws, my ideas about reproducibility really draw from my experiences of building pipeline systems. So Taverna, as was mentioned, is a pipelining workflow environment. So you're able to coordinate the execution of codes and remote services, local services, data resources, and using transparent stepwise methodologies, auto-document those steps, and reuse variants. So the same pipeline for different data will produce different results, or you can alter the steps and you get different methods. So bringing these kinds of automated technologies to pipelining, and then sharing these, because these are artifacts. Most pipelines, most workflows don't start from a green field, they start from a template that somebody else has done. Not, you know, something like 80% of workflows are actually variants on other people's workflows. So I'm interested in social sharing environments, people donating their codes and sharing them. So that's where I'm coming from. And then the second system that's particularly influenced me is a system that I built with my colleagues who are at the front for systems biology in Europe, which allows sort of the long-tail systems biologists in large consortia to store and organize their data, their systems biology models, their standard operating procedures using standards like ISCB, to explore those, to simulate models in a web-based environment, to find colleagues and experts, to manage the pooling and credit that they get for sharing them, to do curation support, and so on. So this is kind of a sharing environment. And we built that for large consortia, large programs in Europe, for virtual liver, for systems biology, and it's been adopted by a whole bunch of other things. But what I discovered was that what I really do is social work. So they were right, because what I do mainly is social engineering in order to be able to understand why don't people reproduce and why don't people share. So that was interesting to me. So onto the main topic, that's my background. Reproducibility, a principle of scientific method. It's the thing that separates scientists from other animals, including other kinds of researchers. So it's not normal for people to, when they get an electric charge, to try it again, but a scientist will, because that is what you do. Wonder if it happens every time. So that is the point of reproducibility. And in computational science, we should have the opportunity to be as the sort of poster children of reproducibility. Because as Donoghue famously said nearly 20 years ago, computational science, a scientific publication, is not the scholarship itself, it's an advertisement for the scholarship. It's the complete software environment and the data. He missed out the data. He wasn't very interested in data at the time, but anyway, the data's there. The complete set of instructions that generate the figures. And we have a tremendous amount of artifacts that we include when we're doing computational science, the algorithms, configuration, the tools, the codes, and so on. And I noticed, I thought when I put the title in, that nobody would be particularly interested in this topic here, but actually turns out that the whole bunch of you are. There's workshop tracks, there's BOSC is thinking of changing its name to Open Science as opposed to Open Software. It's really interesting to see the zeitgeist. Sadly, an experiment is reproducible until another laboratory tries to repeat it. This is the standard Cone quote, and even computational ones. So this has really caused, of late, in the last 5 years, much gnashing of teeth and renting of hair and wailing. We now have, for example, the nature checklist for checking whether you're actually really recording what you said. There's been attacks on authors and editors and reviewers and publishers and funders and just about anybody who has anything to do with science. So you get articles like, you know, landmark publications was a fundamental article. These key landmark publications in cancer research, we cannot actually reproduce the results, so we're wasting money. And like there's, you know, must try harder, you are error prone. I mean, it's like beleaguered, you know, it's like being at the headmaster all the time. You open Nature, you get shouted at for not being able to reproduce. And there's some more thoughtful articles. So it's a particular article from the Galaxy team that looked at next-gen sequencing papers. And they've done a great survey that basically says things like 4 studies, only out of 19 papers that they really examined, only 4 studies provide any settings. 8 studies listed any of the versions of the software that they used. 7 only gave vaguely any details. And we have this issue that although we have lots of data sharing policies in journals, that when you really examine it, a decent number, but not a full collection, actually comply to the rules. So the papers claim, the journals claim that the data must be there, but when you really press home, they're not. And this is a very important paper. This is one where John Ayanadis says that out of 80 microarray papers, 10 could not be reproduced because they're missing data or missing metadata. And the number of retractions, according to an analysis that was published in the New York Times, suggests that soon the number of retractions will outpace the number of submissions. So we're going to do negative research, which I kind of find a bit interesting. Right? Okay, so I've got this far without telling you what is reproducibility. And that's actually quite confusing. Replicate, repeat, rerun, and so on. Regenerate, what do all these words mean? So it's like Humpty Dumpty. When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Now, I can't really give a talk about reproducibility without giving some definitions. So here are my simple definitions. When you repeat, it's the same experiment in the same lab, same codes or same data. Whatever your experiment is, it could be a new algorithm, it could be a new pipeline, it could be a whole series of investigations. Replicate is the same experiment in somebody else's lab, i.e. not with you. Reproduce is doing the same experiment but with some permutation, a different algorithm, different data. You know, something that means it is not exactly the same setup. And reuse is wanting to use the results of the experiment, be that an algorithm, be that some code, be that some data, to do something else, to permute it in some sort of way. So being replicable is not the same as being reproducible. They're in this kind of series of steps. And validation and verification are similar sorts of, well, they're related terms. Validation means I can do things like error measurement and documentation, so I can check whether things are actually there. And verification is, does it actually comply with a regulation or rule imposed by the environment? So we kind of do technical validation and verification, but we do scientific review. This is kind of, in some senses, up for discussion. There's an entire research field in deciding what these words mean. Can you believe it? I can believe it. I've come from an ontology world. I can believe that people argue about what the difference is till they get bored. And where does this fit? And this is really important, because what you do at different places depends what you're doing in the research life cycle. So in the lab, you're repeating in order to be able to defend your results. Does it actually, does the effect really, is it robust? Is it robust? When you're reviewing, you're going through a different phase. It's somebody else certifying to see whether the claims are defendable and whether the approach is sound. And when you then go through this certification process, which is the peer review process that we all know and presumably love, then we go through a period where everybody peer reviews it effectively, because they're looking at the results, they're trying to compare their results, they're trying to reproduce, try something a little bit different, and then it passes through a kind of, into the Parthenon of science, where it's just kind of accepted as that kind of works. So there is a sort of transiency about reproducibility, and there's also this kind of link between the publishing and reporting and the making of resources that I'll be briefly talking about. So why aren't we reproducing things? Now, we could be not reproducing things because we're naughty, so for example, fraud. We could be finding it difficult to reproduce things because it's inherently hard. Like you need a huge compute environment in order to be able to run the algorithm, and you haven't got one. Or there are stochastic kind of aspects, but that's actually not a terribly good excuse. Or you're just plain disorganized, as Phil Bourne tells me he is, where he's about to try and publish a paper on trying to reproduce an algorithm or an experiment he did, where it's taken him 280 hours in order to try and attempt to reproduce something he did in his own lab. So there's difficulties there. And another aspect that's particularly challenging, this is the thing that worries people the most, I think, in the literature, is rigor. Rigorous reporting and experimental design. So I'm sure you all know overly honest methods. Who knows overly honest methods? A few people. Oh, go and have a look at overly honest methods. Your students are probably tweeting into it, saying what they really do as opposed to what they tell you they do in the lab. So here we are. I say my data is statistically significant, but I don't really know how it's calculated. It's kind of, you know, psychiatrist's chair for wet lab scientists mainly. But the big thing here is this notion of misapplication use or misapplied use of black box software. And this is particularly a worry. There's a very interesting paper by Yopper et al. That says they did a survey of people in species distribution modeling actually, and only 8% of those several hundred that they surveyed actually ever validated the software that they use against any other method. They just took it. Regardless of whether they actually understood it or not, and that's extremely worrying. Okay, this is the kind of checkboxes. So now we, for nature as checklist. So this has now got on the agenda, folks. The reproducibility agenda is no longer an agenda for scientists and those who serve scientists. It's actually an agenda item for an entire community of politicians and funders and publishers. So this is a Royal Society report that Janet Thornton, amongst others, contributed to. Basically, it says open science is anyone get hold of anything at any time. And that's, methods, standards, identifiers, licenses, education, policies, everything that's to do with science. Even politicians have got involved. So the G8 Open Data Charter, and you're in trouble when Obama and Cameron in the UK and Merkel from Germany are getting together and talking about open science. You've got the attention is very much upon you. So we're in a situation, we're in a kind of a point which is quite scary as scientists, just sitting in our lab doing our bench science, that on the one hand we've got pressure, we're going to have pressure for the regulators of science, the funding councils demanding their open data mandates. The US are about to invoke various different open mandates. The UK has open data mandates on your science. You won't get funded unless your data is available in a public repository, this kind of thing. And at the same time, we've got this republic of science, as it were, of communities saying we need to be more open with manifestos and resources available. I've done a meta manifesto for you so that you don't have to read the hundreds of manifestos that are now. It's just basically X should be available, accessible forever, the copyright of X should be clear, X should be citable, the people should get credit, it all should be curated, and then we should have world peace and, but this is fine, you can assert these things, but how are you going to do it? What are the real challenges? And we do pretty well, actually, as life scientists in particular. As a community, we have major public data repositories, we have multiple declarations, we have core facilities, we have lots of standardization activities, we have great stories about how the E. coli was sequenced and dealt with in a matter of weeks through open science activities and crowdsourcing efforts. That's the picture on the open science poster of the Royal Society, is that E. coli. But when you really look at it, you're really discovering that there's already squabbles. Yeah, it was an open data effort, but then there were at least 2 universities who said, yeah, but we got there first, but we didn't tell you about the data because we wanted to publish the paper first. So it's kind of, this is a complicated setup. And some of it's just hard. Patient data is so hard, I'm not going to talk about it because it's too hard. International complications to do with data moving across borders, bleeding heart paternalism, where we think we know better than patients about whether their data should be available or not. The fear of being, of one patient's data being identified, so you have defensive research. So there's a whole movement to create informed consent and fortresses around particularly patient data as we move towards more the life sciences actually delivering real value to patients. And in fact, there's seminal work by Sage, in particular, on creating trusted brokers, by John Wilbanks in particular, for doing informed consent, and in fact, the Elixir project in Europe, which will be speaking this afternoon, is also working in this particular area. So this is very hard. But that isn't what I'm going to talk about. What I want to talk about is the long tail The kind of decentralized, this is what people really are worried about. They're not really worried about big deposition in data sets and so on, because that's all handled. It's the dark data. It's the data not in the paper. It's the data in your filing cabinet. It's the data on the USB stick. It's the data that's never going to appear in the paper but was paid for by the public purse and could be useful to somebody else. It's making data a first-class citizen. It's really dealing with the fact that that data is held in fragmented places and it's fragile and it's hard to get at the point of delivery. When I have the paper, how do I get hold of the data? Not today, but in the future. So that is what people are really fretting about at the moment. But we are not bad people. We make progress. There was never a golden age. So why is it so hard? So I thought I'd have a little thought about, well, why are we struggling so much? Well, it's because science is now, particularly life sciences, it's big and it's fast and it's complicated and it's multi-step. It's worse than it ever was. It's not a few data points like it was 20, 30 years ago. It's multiple, it's terabytes of data. We have, at the same time, we have do-it-yourself publishing and greater access to these resources where we didn't before, 30 years ago. And we have expectations of reproducibility that we didn't have. So we've got higher expectations, and yet we've got more complicated setups. So it's kind of not surprising. Those of us who are old can remember writing to people for their data. We're using letters, old-fashioned things that you wrote, with pens and everything. And that we're kind of sped up our whole publishing environment, and yet we expect things to have got easier to reproduce. Why would that be? In particular, we've also developed a reviewing approach, which is, at the moment, particularly for journals that aren't like PLOS or F1000, focused on attention grabbing, where only neat and positive results are published, or reviews actually are focused on. That's not how I would have done it. It's kind of, so it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that if data is really, if you've got bad data or data that you don't want people to see, you don't want to put it in your paper because then it doesn't give you a neat story. So we've got to get out of that routine. So that's another thing that's worried. We're all operating in a scientific sweatshop. So when I started, science was a country club. You just sat around and you had a good idea, and then occasionally you wrote a paper if you had something to say. Now, we're constantly measured. How many papers have you produced? How much data are you getting out? What's your tenure track CV looking like? So it is a sweatshop of little resources, little time, and also a kind of sense, well, everybody else is doing it. I won't be found out. So we kind of created an environment of getting things published rather than getting it right. And how many of us have tried to rewrite a paper to please the reviewer, even though we knew the reviewer was stupid? Who's done that? Yeah, come on, guys. Testify. Right. How many people have cited something, but they hadn't really read the paper? Come on, guys. Yeah, put your hands up. So you get this citation drift. And Tim Clark, who's my colleague in the audience, will say, citation drift is really difficult. You find when you really look, it turns out that isn't the mouse they really used when you really read the paper, kind of thing. Who actually does independent replication studies? Oh, nobody. Self-correcting science, yeah, whatever. It's very hard. Who pays you? Would your PI say, why are you replicating somebody else's stuff? Because you can't publish it. You haven't got any, and it costs money to do that experiment, right? It's resource intensive, it's hard, it's blue-collar science, as John Quaganbush says, and blue-collar science doesn't actually make you any money or win any Nobel Prizes. Independent reviewing is blue-collar science too as well. So what's the point? Well, people say that nobody will want to do it. The questions don't change, but the answers do, so people do. So in 2 years' time, when the paper is written, the reviewers want additional work, statisticians want more runs, analysis maybe need to repeat it, postdoc leaves, student arrives, new data, revised data, and so on. So we know that there is a point to making things more reproducible, and anyway, it's kind of, there's a trickle-down theory that the more you make your data and your results reproducible, the more credit you'll get, and there's some evidence. Heather Puawas has evidence, and other people will use your results for novel discoveries, for meta-analysis, and so on. So that's all a bit depressing. So let's get some good news. So the good news is there are reproducible systems available that do instrumented desktops, that host services, that package and archive your results, that provide repositories. There's lots of them, integrative authoring, lots and lots of them. You probably don't even know. It's a fine set of logos here. I've built some, so here's a Seek systems biology platform, which allows these groups to put their models and their data and their papers and put them all up so everybody can see how this is the model that was in the paper. You can run the model with this data. It's all connected. I've built environments where you can share, you have a paper which with a pipeline, and the pipeline and all the data associated it is in this repository. You can just go to it and download it. GigaScience has been building their whole world on top of this. So it's their data journal where you can, they will copy edit your method and put it into a Galaxy pipeline or Galaxy workflow and make your bunch of dodgy Perl scripts you found down the back of the sofa into a reproducible pipeline. It took them 6 months to do one paper because it's flipping hard, as Scott Edmonds told us yesterday, because they had to retrospectively make this reproducible. Loads of negotiating with the previous authors, or with the authors. But you can do it from the kind of multiple different environments. So this is their setup. You know, they have data, they have open review, they have open code, there are IDs for everything, and so on. So there's lots of, I won't go through the details of it, you just have to know it exists. Phil Bourne says he wants a paper as an experiment. You know, here's the paper, click on the model, all the model's alive, it's not dead in this PDF. I can play with it, you know, I can move the features around, that will lead to new papers. The paper becomes an active object. Well, you can do that. IPython is a notebook environment for Python, so you can generate from the IPython notebook the actual figures. You could publish through using this, and in fact, Titus Brown has done that. Or even better, well, not better, because that's a kind of as you go along, Utopia is a tool built by a colleague, Steve Pettifer and Terry Atwood, who may be in the audience, where you can take a dead PDF and you can scrape the data from it and turn it back into live. And this is actually, ironically, a paper from Phil Bourne, which has data in it, actually it was in XML, which has now been scratched out of that paper, turned into live data, so you can recompute and see if you get the same figures, and you can change numbers and see if you get different figures. Also links to Dryad and so on. This turns the paper back into a live object, but it's all hard work. It's all hard work, right? These systems are not integrated. And so I stole this slide from Phil Bourne as well. It's not stealing, it's tribute. That's what it is. It's only, if you cite, it's not stealing. So you have all these authoring tools and lab books and so on. We have some. This means he doesn't think there is there's enough. Here he thinks we've kind of got there, and here he thinks we're nearly there. Actually, I would say we have got all of these things, but you don't know about them, and they don't link together, and they don't fit well in your pipeline, and they are hard to use. But, you know, they do exist. So the message number one is, if you build systems, if you use systems, we have to lower the friction of being able to publish reproducible tools. We have to make those tools easier to use. So this is the only equation I've got in my talk, because I noticed all the other talks had equations. So here's an equation that if you want to be able to get something adopted, you have to really reduce the friction, raise the number of people that will be impacted, and presumably because interest is fixed. If interest is a very large number and it's still hard, then you can get away with your equation there being a little bit more friction. But this Nalon equation, which I'm now going to, in honor of Cameron Nalon, get everybody to tweet the Nalon equation. This is what we need to do in our environments. And we need to make our processes and our tools born reproducible. Because what we learned from the Gigascience story is doing retrospective reproducibility is really hard. So I'm an engineer, and engineers, computer engineers, when they come to a problem, they say, how do I systematically architect my way out of this problem? Because engineers, they have a hammer, they see a nail, they bang it, they see something else, they still bang it. We always have the same approach, right? So here's the 4+1 engineering view that we take when we're architecting systems. And so I took the 4+1 view to all the systems that I've been looking at and how we might do reproducibility. There's the functional view, the how do we examine the process, there's how do we do development, and there's what's the physical view. So I'll just go through the logic. I've already mentioned some of these things now, the rigor and reporting. Some more tweets. I can't send you the original data because I don't remember what the Excel names files mean. Most of the data requested by the editors is data I excluded on purpose because it contradicted the paper. Come on, guys, who did that? You must have done it, everybody's done it, right? So, what were my observations of working with particularly the systems biologists who we were persuading to contribute their data, to share their data, to be more open in their way that they do their modeling, the way that they do their data sharing across consortium that were actually competing consortium. We have 15 competing multi-partner consortiums across Europe, all working on the same sorts of areas, about 300 or 400 scientists, and they were told retrospectively after their projects they had to share. That's scary. So the first thing we learned is that if you have strict policies, people will follow them. So be very careful about your policies, because if you say you will share after you've published, you will only get sharing after you've published, and there will be no sharing otherwise. Modelers and workflow makers will share methods, and experimentalists will not share data. There's a big difference there. Young researchers are enthusiastic, they are our advocates, they were real keen on doing this, but they have to be supported by their PIs, and many felt they weren't given any time to make their stuff open, or any time to make their stuff reproducible. Buddy reproducibility testing really works. I've made my data really clearly described, and so everybody will be able to use it. Okay, let's try it. Let's test it in a group that isn't you. Right? A proper replication, oh, it doesn't really work. I can't really do it. So buddy reproducibility really works. It's a big problem, so we had to sort of chip away at it. So we had to create environments where it was just enough, just in time sharing, just enough, just in time metadata collection. That's a bit against the born reproducibility idea, but people have to have the chance to do things over incrementally. And the big drivers for when people really made things open, really made things better described, is when staff leave, when they're open to public scrutiny, when they're local systems, I want to put it on my data set and I don't want to put it in your shared environment, but my data environment is decaying because the postdoc just left, who was the only one who understood it. These are really big drivers. So this long-term safe commitment, somewhere safe to put my things, and that was partnered with funder commitment right from the beginning. The funders funded the resource and continue to fund the resource. The peaks, can anybody guess what happens for the peaks of when people contribute? No, not publication, review by the funding councils, yay. So I looked at these results and I told my colleagues about it in social science, and they said, yeah, that's completely obvious. That's the model of collaboration behavior. Don't you read the literature? Yeah, but it's social science literature. There's some well understood models of why people don't share and do share, and I'm going to summarize them now. The scientific ecosystem. First of all, you have to build everything around the scientist. So you have to build scientist-centric systems, not science-centric systems, quite different. And that means understanding what are the fears and what are the drivers of scientific research. Of course, we're doing it for love and great science, but also in order to get credit, to get competitive advantage. And particularly, one has to deal with the fact that you're afraid of being scooped, the cost of taking this on, being dependent on environments. This is actually called the norms of scientific behavior and principles of scientific communication, but that's what it basically is. The second thing you have to understand is your local asset economy. So this is an economic model of exchange that if you have significant local investment in getting some data, then you're not going to share it. But if you have to collectively purchase your data, by collaborating with somebody else, then you will share it. So you have to understand the trading mechanisms that exist as well. And you have to understand that we operate in an asymmetrical reciprocity model, which basically means we data hug. So I have my data hugging is, this is my data, but you can't have it. But more importantly, we found in SISMO, we do data flirting. And flirting is where you say, I've got some data, and here's a little bit of metadata that will interest you, but to really work with me, you're going to have to take me on a date. And you're going to have to put me on your paper, and then you can work with me. So that's data flirting, and that's ubiquitous in science. We all flirt. That's what papers are. They're data flirting exercises. Voyeurism, which is I want to use your data, but I don't want to give you anything back. So inertia, I don't want to do anything. So we have this sort of sharing creep that I'll share with family, and then I'll share with friends, and then I'll share with acquaintances, and then I'll share with strangers and other people, notably rivals and ex-colleagues. Ex-colleagues are the strongest fear of sharing, actually. People are very, people's colleagues moved from their lab. They were the ones that this particular group of people were most feared of sharing with. Interesting. And basically local control. One of the key things here is value of the product. So we've had a big drive of value of all the research products. We have to value the data, we value the models, we value the reviewing. We reward you for sharing, we reward you for doing data, curating your data, curating your codes so it can be reproduced. And there's been a sort of this data citation mechanism. So there's infrastructure, there's ORCID IDs so that you can identify individuals. There's data IDs so you can identify data. There's things like impact story and altmetrics which will try to track your credit. But the problem that we have to address is that all research products and all scholarly labor are equally valued until it comes to promotion and review committees. And so to make this work, we, particularly senior scientists, have to make that change. So message 2, this is to make things reproducible, we have to make it worthwhile for the careers of people. And that means we have to treat citation and credit and like it's love and not money. And so when I love somebody, that doesn't mean I have any less love to give to somebody else. So but if I give money to somebody else, then I've got less money, and I can't give it to somebody, that extra money. So we need to treat this, we need to really respect that. And that means large data providers, codes, we have to stop this click and run. I've got it, I'll go. No, we have to get the feedback loop back. I used your thing, I used your data, I reproduced it. And that also implies to infrastructure like data sets. We're notoriously bad, as a paper recently showed, of actually citing major data collections. You know, only 30% of Alvis's Array Express papers that he surveyed in 2011 who used Array Express actually cited Array Express. Recently, a colleague of mine, Robert Stevens, has been doing a systematic analysis of which systems are actually cited in the literature. Do you want to know which one? R. R is the most cited platform in the literature. Okay, so I'm going to speed up now. So the barriers: time to code and document, dealing with questions from other users. These are the big barriers. So it's sort of fear that if I actually make it so that other people can use it, other people will use it. So that's a bit of a worry. Other fears: it's not ready yet, I need another publication. Shame. Shame is a big worry. It's too ugly, I didn't work out the details. It's too much effort, the reviewers don't really need it. The student left, I don't know how to do it. You wouldn't understand it. I made it so nobody could understand it. This is actually what I was told. These are actual direct quotes, folks. But I don't know what we can do about this in security. But certainly things like shame. We do have a Goldilocks paradox, that description needed to make an experiment reproducible is too much for the author and too little for the reader. So we need to do, to figure out this just enough, just in time curating. And we've been trying to do that in our projects. So one of the best things we ever did was we instrumented Excel so that as you filled out your data at the wet lab, it cunningly was collecting correct control vocabulary terms because we'd wired them into the spreadsheet, and they just looked like drop-downs. And so this sort of adhered to the MIBI and the ISCB standards for data collection. So we create the template, you then just use vanilla Excel or OpenOffice, and then you can pull that all apart afterwards to be able to register the metadata and catalogs and so on. This is the single most successful thing we ever did for collecting data because nobody noticed it. So it's restricting the friction, reducing the friction of curation. But when it comes down to it, anonymous reuse is hard. It's nearly always negotiated. Or because you just end up not being able to describe enough. A word on codes, reskilling software, making practices. So this is another slight concern. People don't release their codes. People have a surprisingly, this is very depressing as a computer scientist, that formal training and development of software is important. Actually, it's quite important, I would have thought. But you can't say my code sucks, but I don't care. That's, I won't release it because I don't think computer science is important. And so actually we have a couple of paradoxes there that to do with incremental biology and computer science, but I won't have time to go into that. What I will say is just give out your code. And in fact, there's an academic license called the CRAPL license, which promises that your data will be licensed and open, and it doesn't matter how crap it was, nobody will laugh at it. So use the CRAPL license. Or better still, do better software. So software carpentry is an initiative that is kind of rolling out across the US and Europe, which is improving the quality of software for the 95% of scientists who do software, not the 5% who know what they're doing and use fancy environments, but the 95% who are knocking up some Perl scripts and don't know how version control works. So better software, better research, people. That's what we need. And this is Greg Wilson and Titus Brown, who are sort of leaders of this, and these are quite good likenesses, which is a bit of a worry. Anyway. A word on reinventing. It's okay to reinvent. Sean Eddy mentioned at Bosc in an excellent keynote that he reinvented stochastic context-free grammars because he didn't read the literature, just like I didn't read the social science literature. But it's okay because his research was to do with algorithms and methodologies, and by reinventing, by recoding those, he learnt more. That's his bit of reproducing. So reinvent what is innovative and reuse what is utility. Obviously, it doesn't make any sense for him to invent, description object identifiers or document object identifiers. So message 3, take action. This is another of my models. You can't just analyze these environments and, or say, we will do these things without understanding the impact. And you need at least 4 things to do this. You can't change how you give credit to people who are doing reproducibility without understanding the culture, the process, the metrics, and the organizational framework. You need all 4 of those to be in place. You can't just say, I assert that you should get credit without saying, well, how do I do that? And what are the metrics? Because we will optimize towards metrics. So we have to be mindful of this. So the last bit about the mechanics of reproducibility is to do with the gathering of things together, as the sort of reassembly, as it were, of things. So when we're doing computational reproducibility, we're basically building IKEA furniture, which is, we all know, a hard thing to do. So you have to gather the bits together, you find the right bits, the bits are broken and changed and lost. I have other bits, and the bits that were actually on the page is written in Swahili. I understand the bits, I've got to understand the bits, how to put together. Does this bit really matter? I can use a different tool, can't I? I've got a hammer, not a screwdriver. Ooh, that's not going to work, but I've got a screwdriver and not a hammer, that'll work. So that's the kind of thing that we need to do. And this is complicated. This is complicated. We've got specialist codes, we've got gateways, we're using all different sorts of things. Kind of the reproducibility stories, which are simple, which is, I just wrote a little bit of Perl. That's great. But then what about the libraries? And what about the infrastructure it ran on? And did you really just use one collection of data, one little bit of Perl? Did you really do that? In the scale of science that we really do? I particularly like this tweet from Overly Honest Methods. You can download our code from the URL supplied. Good luck with downloading the only postdoc who can get it to run. I particularly like that one. So this is where it really matters what we mean by repeat, replicate, reproduce, and reuse. Because this is to do with snapshotting, it's to do with packaging things and fixing things in time. So we have materials, we have methods, we have the setup of the instrument, and we have the laboratory. And in computational science, we have the ability to completely replicate the laboratory if we wish. We can't copy a wet lab, but we can copy a compute lab. And that's what makes it interesting. So the materials are the data sets, the methods are the techniques and algorithms, the instruments are the codes and the data sets and the underlying libraries that you're using. And the laboratory is the compute infrastructure and so on that you used. And depending what it is, you have to fix the original or you have to do something different. I won't go into the details, but you get the idea, right? So workflows have actually turned out to be damn useful. Even Phil Bourne said they were useful in his paper, so that must be true, because he was very skeptical. Because we're doing multi-step science, and workflows capture the steps. So you can have your individual code. I've made my code better software, better code. Now I have to stitch it together and assemble it. And standardized pipelining environments, integrative pipelining environments of whatever kind. I built one called Taverna. Many people use Galaxy. Same sort of idea. They auto-record the experiment. They report automatically what you really did. They allow you to see clearly what has been done, and they buffer you from the infrastructure. So this is great. So this workflow is from biodiversity. You take some data in, it uses Google Refine, it uses some data sets, it uses some R, it uses some scripts, it uses some third-party and remote environments. They also collect, to varying degrees, provenance. And provenance is the Lord's work, because provenance is the link between computation and results. It's a thing that says, what did you do? So it's a verifiable record. It's virtual witnessing as what did you actually do? You can track changes and then you can use it to repair. It's different. So I'm automatically tracking what I did. I can, even if I can't reproduce the result or repeat the result because the data set's changed or the code is no longer available. At least I can see a sort of dead record of what you did and verify whether I think that was actually sensible. We even have standards for representing provenance called the PROV standard, a very, obviously, from the World Wide Web Consortium. Who knew that? Apart from the people who work for me. One person at the back. Well done, that man. Unfortunately, an experiment is only as transparent as the visibility of its steps. So one of the difficulties, one of the good things we've got is service-orientated science. So lots of, I can use your codes, I can use different services, I can make them available through the web. But they're black boxes. I don't know. I can see what I'm doing. I'm linking these together, but I don't know what's going on inside. And that goes back to the use of software without mindfully understanding what the software is actually really doing. So that's a bit of a problem. We do have closed codes, proprietary codes, and so on. But at least we should try. Particularly, we have magic cloud services. I just used this thing on the cloud. I have no idea how it really works. So that's a bit of a worry. And the other thing is we have dependencies because we have lots of steps. Not all those steps are owned or hosted by you. They may be owned and hosted by other people, other data collectors, and so on. So the degree of self-containment is the degree that you can really reassemble or reproduce. So versioning and access to things is what really hampers things, and the spin rate of versions of things. So this is a paper by Zhao, which looked at about 300 workflows on my experiment, and changes in third-party providers was the major reasons why those workflows didn't work anymore, because the service had gone. And so that at least you had a record of what was done. You could verify the steps that they took through the workflow, even if you couldn't rerun it anymore, but you could fix it. So there's a big movement to say, well, put everything you depend upon into a box. We call it a virtual machine. And as Alan, my colleague, said, well, for some of these workflows, all you need to do is copy the box that the internet is in, and then we'll be all right. But that's a bit tricky. But there are attempts to copy the box of the internet. So here is our third model, which is the physical, the model to do with reproducibility. So if I have to figure out how reproducible any of my stuff is, it's how open is it, how well described is it, how can I package it, so can I put it in a virtual machine, wrap up all the codes, wrap up the environment, create a virtual machine that will operate on other resources, basically copy the lab. But make the codes available so it will recompute. Can I put it in a cloud system, or can I just archive it? Just describe the hell out of it, put it into a big zip or tar file, and put it in a virtual filing cabinet, a digital filing cabinet. And so all of this is the model. So for if you were auditing your reproducibility of your lab and your computational experiments, this is an auditing framework. How portable is it? Can I port it somewhere else? Can I package it up? How preserved is it? How can I describe it? But also, how variable is it? So to what are the degrees of variation, and to what degree do they matter? So does it matter that the API on the call to the GBIF data service slightly changed, so the pipeline will have to be altered? Probably not. Right? Does it matter that some significant set of data in GBIF was revised? Yes, that does matter. So it depends. You have to know what is the variability. In computers, there is actually a packaging argument at the moment. So in the reproducibility world of people building these frameworks, there's a big Judeans front, People's Front, and the People Front of Judea. The Judean People's Front say everything should be a virtual machine. That basically says, get all your code, get all your data, package it up, put it in a box so that I can port it and then rerun it out of the box, using VMware or one of these virtual box type of environments. It's a copy of the computational environment. But that creates a black box. I can recompute things, I could run your data set and run it and see that it's true. Yeah, you did get the result, but that's like, it's a computer, other than some moderation about the sort of how the floating point might work on the particular kit that you're operating on. Of course I expect to get the same numbers. It's not the same as understanding what it does. And for that you need open source. Yeah, I'm just coming up to the... So this is a bit of bickering that's going on. And it's basically pointless bickering, because you need both. You need really good description, an archive record, see the white boxes for reproducibility, and then you need to repeat, but you can repeat using the computation. My colleague Julie McMurray in EBI calls this inertia, which is the tendency of nerds, mostly technical computing people, to overcomplicate and over-engineer something until you can't do anything. So I think it's quite a nice term. I might use the term inertia. But for the big problems, big worries, big data, big compute, we still haven't solved that. Community facilities, cloud costs, data scales, the capability to be able to deal with large computes and large data, we still haven't solved from a reproducibility. And so the core meeting today, a couple of days ago, people said, well, once the experiment is done, then I have to just give the PI the data on a drive, and then they go and put it in a filing cabinet because I haven't got the resources to keep it. So now we've just turned to putting the data into a hard drive, and the hard drive is now in the filing cabinet. So the message number 4 is, you cannot reproduce everything all the time. All experiments become less reproducible over time. There's a reproducibility window, okay? And the important thing is to know what the window is and what matters about that window. So results may vary. Here's my genetic slide. You are going to have different variations. So what you need to know is to plan to preserve, but to expect to repair. Description persists, computers die. So you really have to describe this, and you may have to only do partial replication. So to sum up, coming towards the end of this talk now, the other 5th message is the long-term sustainability of all of this infrastructure of the hosts. The fact that we've got this complicated environment where there are data repositories, there's compute repositories, there are code repositories, there's cloud infrastructures, there's virtual machine hosting environments, it's fragmented multiple stewardship, and how are we going to sustain all that? Many of these things are third-party services. How do we know that VM Depot, which is a virtual machine hosting platform from Microsoft, will still be there in 6 years' time or 6 months' time? It's kind of a bit scary. And the puppies analogy is that software and data are free, like puppies are free. Have you heard this one? Yeah, some of you? That so you get a free puppy, woohoo! But now you've got to feed it, you've got to walk it, it's going to chew up your carpet, it's going to get sick, and it's going to die. So that's what happens to your puppies. And software and data are just like that too. So there is no such thing as free. You have to pay for it. And paying for it, this is recurring costs. Another way of saying recurring costs, right? I recommend using it with politicians. It works. They understand puppies, they don't understand software. So, so here's the meta manifesto. Make X reproducible, open, from cradle to grave. Tools and repositories need to be made to help. Researchers should be able to adapt their working practices. The cost and responsibility has to be borne out by everybody, and that means changing the practices. We're going to have to apply that 4-point picture to how do we do publishing, how do we do funding, how do we do review. We're going to have to systematically analyze all of that. And so my last point before Julie drags me off is to say, one of the fundamental things I think we're doing wrong is we're not mirroring research. So research is an evolution. We fork research. We pool, we merge research results. We have different parts to research, different investigations, different experiments, different data, different codes, different algorithms. And they operate on different cycles, and they have different authors. But we factor all of our research publishing as if it's one thing. It's this paper, right? And it's just a snapshot of all these subparts. This is kind of dumb. It's not actually reflecting how we really share, how we do research is not reflected in how we share and publish our research components. And instead, I'm a software engineer. So that means I think research is like software, which means it's versioned, it has multiple parts to it, people are responsible for those different parts, and we incrementally build it. It's a series of releases with differences between the different releases, clearly articulated, with people responsible for maintaining those pieces of the research, with clearly managed forking processes, clearly managed merging processes, with threads, okay? And so we should be publishing all of our resources. We shouldn't be publishing data, we should be releasing data. Data is not a document, it is like software, and there's a very good paper that describes this. And I think we made a fundamental mistake thinking things are fixed. And so I think we need to chop up our research, and we need to change completely the way that we promote and share research as following software engineering practices, not following library practices. That's my kind of big thing. That may even mean, but we'd be able to cope with our tendency to do salami publishing, where we chop up our research into little slices and then feed it out to different journals so we can get the maximum number of papers we can possibly manage out of it. We need to be able to track that mindfully. And with that in mind, my group and others have been developing this idea of a research object, a way of being able to structure and bundle descriptions of research and resources using standard mechanisms that's quite explicitly saying it's an object, it's not a paper. And there is no one thing, it's not a workflow. It's a workflow with many things associated with it, a part of it, of a whole thing. A collection of things. So this research object idea allows us to have checklists for descriptive reproducibility, to package things that are described in different and held by different resources, to facilitate exchange between different resources and researchers, and maybe create a framework for research release and threading of research, a bit like Faculty of 1,000, like we did in Code, like Faculty of 1,000 do. So here's a bit of my experiment with this idea embedded into it. This gives you sort of the idea of it being released out. In order to be able to do that, we need models, and we've developed, as part of a project called Workflow Forever, the models that you need. You need identity. You need a way of being able to group things together. You need a way of being able to describe dependencies, the minimum information you need for that particular experiment, how it varies, and what the versions are. So, here are the messages again. Lower friction, born reproducible. Credit is like love. Take action today. Don't sit on your posteriors and think somebody else will do it, because it's going to happen to you, because we've got Cameron and Merkel and Obama on your case. They're busy, data will be available. So, it's going to affect you, because you won't get a grant soon unless you can show that your data is open, your code is available, open source, and that somebody else is using it. So it's really important. Prepare for the reproducible window, because it's not going to last, and puppies aren't free. So my final message is following up the action this day. Winston Churchill said, action this day. I actually meant do it. Don't worry about doing it well, just do it. Do a little bit, just do it. So it's don't get so bogged down, it's going to be so complicated, just do it. And I hope my models will help you frame how to do it. And at the other end of the political spectrum is Che Guevara, who said, the revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe, you have to make it drop. And The people who will make it drop are us, because we are the reviewers. We are the people who sit on the funding councils who decide what grants will be funded. We are the people who do peer review. We are the people who run the labs. We are the people who do the science. So when people say, oh, the funders don't fund it, or the publishers don't publish it, or, you know, it's us. It's us. You know, who are they? It's us. So we should start. Thanks.
Thank you very much for very inspiring and entertaining and non-social biology talk. We have time for a couple of questions. The microphones are on the sides if you can reach them. If you can't, shout loudly. So I have a question in the meantime while we're waiting for people to get to the mics. Do you think that the current repositories for data make it more difficult for researchers to share by asking a lot of information that researchers can't provide, or by being opaque to what they're actually asking for?
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yes, so it's part of this friction issue. That the friction so the desire is to want. It's a mismatch, okay? So there's a desire to want to collect everything that you want, that will be reusable for somebody who you don't know, which is actually, by the way, very hard. But at the same time, it's a cost to be able to do that. And getting that match is difficult. And what the difficulty with the data repository, many of the data repositories, is they're a one-shot. Right? So you have to give all the data, metadata, before you can put it in. And what we did in the SEEK system is we didn't make it one shot. We tried to collect it at different places in the pipeline. So we collected it through sneaking in curation practices right at the beginning, and then allowing you to collect and add more metadata or more descriptions as you went along, and as interest became apparent. So as you got more interest, people were more interested, you could add more stuff in. But the data repositories don't do that.
So we have a question here?
Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. Two related questions. One is, in your experience, what's our trajectory? Are we doing better? And the second question is, it seems like a lot of the things you present are sort of burdened by legacy from the field. If you had to reinvent one thing where you could ignore what currently exists, the currently existing paradigms, what would that be?
Oh, interesting. So, so are we getting better? I think we are, which goes against the common trend of all the, it's all a disaster, the sky is falling in, that's being at the moment. Because I think we're more aware of the situation. And I think what is not taken into account is this negotiation. So reproducing things just without any negotiating, or reusing without any negotiating with the originator is really difficult and is invisible. It's an invisible activity. So people just see these things as if they're like, they don't see the dynamics of the reproducibility activity. So I think it clearly does happen. What would I reinvent from the very beginning? I would invent, so from an engineering perspective, I would invent tracking. So I would try to instrument every data set or every tool with just simple tracking of an ID of who was using it and an ID of who was of what it was. And from a sociological point of view, I would deal with the credit. I would change the kind of what is valued in the research life cycle. And it isn't just a paper at the end. It's the entire collection, including training and everything else around it. It's the entire collection of activities. And I would assert that in 1665 as opposed to now, because you know, we've kind of lost. We've kind of got to this strange position where that's the only thing that counts, as if it's a signal of everything else. So that's what I would change.
So I think we can take one more question on that side, and then I'm sure Carole will answer questions
I'll be
here
here
at the
the rest of the day.
Anyway, so
and I'll be in the Elixir session this afternoon. Come and hear about how Elixir is going to deal with all of this.
So I guess my question is kind of related to that. You mentioned puppies aren't free. How do you plan on actually sort of supporting the infrastructure for everyone's data to be available? Is there a plan for some sort of vastly distributed network, or are we going
Yes,
to depend?
it's called Elixir. No, that's a glib, and Janet's now panicking. She's in the audience. Oh my God, what you just said. But yes, there is a recognition that you can't just do this. You can't just state we need to do this and then expect it to happen. There has to be resources made available, and it can't be just the PhD student in a lab doing it all themselves. There has to be infrastructure in place. And personally, I think we need to create national and international infrastructure to be able to do that, which is properly funded. That means, again, changing the agenda of what is valued. It's not just novel research, it's the infrastructure. So I do see movements in those directions. It's very difficult because funding agencies, and that includes peer review panels, always want to see novelty as opposed to things that enable. They'll always give money to another PhD student rather than a software developer. So we need to change that mindset. And with that in mind, I'm pretty well doing, my career is now pretty well just sitting on funding councils, shouting about that, along with other people. So I think there will be a change, but meanwhile, it'd be interesting to see what business models will emerge. Things like the reproducibility initiative, things like FigShare, things like the whole kind of the sort of business of becoming there may be even a business model in providing infrastructure for reproducibility that you can then cost into your grants, provided by business.
As a brief follow-up, what about using some sort of BitTorrent-based system or crowdsourcing type thing?
Yeah, I didn't get, that's a whole new game. Yeah, there's a whole other, I didn't even get to that. But yes, there's lots of people who are looking at those kinds of ideas, you know, spreading the risk, spreading the load. Yeah, there's an entire talk on crowdsourcing and what does that mean for enabling reproducibility, and what does it mean when you crowdsourced for being able to figure out what do people really do, which is an interesting problem. Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.